Hello world, it's Austin. Let's talk about being transgender and Christian. So, I'm transgender and I do tend to spend a lot of time thinking about and dealing with my body. I'm physically transitioning, which means I have to deal with a lot of things like acne and sweat and body hair and things that most cisgender guys have to deal with when they're teenagers, but I also have trans-specific issues like dealing with my chest being bigger than most guys' chests. Some people think that transgender folks spend more time thinking about their bodies than cisgender people, but based on the number of ads for things like makeup and weight loss supplements and body hair removal, I'd say that that's probably not true. As people of faith, though, we're called to direct ourselves towards something more important than just our own personal bodies. And that's true no matter whether we're trans or cis. This is not to say that our bodies aren't important, they definitely are, and if you want to see the video on why they're important, go click over here. But what I'm saying is that there are things that are more important. So let's talk today about Galatians chapter 5 and the Apostle Paul's thoughts on the flesh and the spirit. Paul's letter to the Galatians was prompted by the fact that some teachers had come to the church in Galatia saying that the people there needed to be circumcised in order to be saved. Basically, the church was being told that they had to become Jewish before they could become Christian. But Paul says, no, wait a minute, we don't have to follow the laws of Moses in order to be saved by Christ, because we are not saved by the things we do, we're saved by God's grace. Paul goes even further than this, and says in the beginning of chapter 5 that Jesus won't even be any good to the people in the church at Galatia if they decide to be circumcised, because then, knowing the things they know, they'll be choosing their own works over God's works. They'll be relying on their own works to get closer to God, rather than relying on God's grace, which will pull them closer. Now, this isn't to say that Paul was against circumcision per se. He himself was circumcised, and he speaks about circumcision as sort of a neutral act in both 1 Corinthians and Romans. Paul's issue wasn't that circumcision was bad, he just wanted to make sure that people knew that it wasn't a requirement for salvation. Paul says in Galatians chapter 5 verse 6 that in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. The only thing that counts is faith working through love. In short, what you do or don't do to your body in the end doesn't really matter. What matters is faith working through love. So are trans people going to move themselves any closer to God by changing their bodies? Paul says absolutely not. We don't rely on our own works to get closer to God. We rely on God's grace. But are trans people going to get further away from God if they change their body? Based on Paul's argument here, it seems very unlikely unless you're doing it for the wrong reasons. But just because Paul says we're set free from the law and free from trying to get to God by our own strength, that doesn't mean that we're allowed to just go around doing whatever we want. Verses 13 and 14 say, "For you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, only do not use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence, but through love become slaves to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Basically, Paul's saying, hey, you don't have to spend all your time worrying about whether you're in or out, or whether you're good enough or not. All that time you used to spend worrying about yourself and what you do, you're done with that now. Now spend that time and energy on other people instead. He goes on to say that we should spend our new freedom living in the spirit rather than in the flesh. Well, what is living in the flesh? Living in the flesh, Paul says, includes a whole list of things found in verses 19 through 21, including fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. And if you look at that list, basically every single one of them has to do with either the self-centeredness or the who needs God, I'll do it myself attitude that Paul says we are now free from. So he says, hey, don't go back to living under the things that you used to live under. You're done with that. On the contrary, we should live according to the Spirit, and Paul says that the fruits of the Spirit, in verses 22 and 23, are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And all those things are about turning outward toward others and being open to receiving grace. Well, what does all this have to do with being trans? First of all, let's dispel a myth. I've heard people say that transgender folks are just envious and jealous of other people's bodies. Like, for instance, a trans man is just super jealous of another person's masculine body, and that's what being trans is all about. And therefore, they think, since jealousy and envy are bad, then being trans must be bad. Now, while I'll totally admit to wishing I had Chris Evans' abs or Jackie Chan's strength, that's not what makes somebody trans, and if it was, there would be a heck of a lot more trans people out there. Transgender people don't covet other people's bodies, we just want to be at home in our own skin. We don't want to pull some kind of weird sci-fi body swap with anybody. We just want to be loved for who we are. And this is why social and medical transition can actually lead to the good fruits of the Spirit. Because when we change things about our bodies to lessen our dysphoria, we end up being freed from the self-consciousness that keeps us all turned in on ourselves. Transgender Christians recognize that nothing we do gets us closer to God, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't work on reducing the roadblocks between ourselves and other people and between ourselves and God. Think of it this way. Somebody from another country is talking to you, but they don't speak your language and you've got earplugs in. You can't make them speak your language, but you can take your earplugs out. We have to trust that God has already started speaking in our language. Now, are we going to be able to open ourselves up enough to listen? Paul recognized that we are only saved through grace, but he still asked the Galatians to change things in their lives in order to produce the good fruit of the Spirit. So shouldn't we be moving through those changes as well? Thanks for watching this week, everybody, and I hope you'll go check out Galatians 5 for yourselves. It's a fascinating part of a fascinating book, and it's not even that long. Anyway, please comment below if you have any questions, hit subscribe if you want to see more of these videos, and we will see you back here next Wednesday. Peace, everybody.